The goal of this podcast is to give you, Orthodox clergy and lay leaders, the knowledge, tools, and resources you need to be better stewards of your influence and have a greater impact on the organizations you lead. I'm here today with Deacon Michael Hyatt. How you doing, Deacon Michael?
I'm doing great, Ann. Good to see you. Good to see everybody that's on this session with us.
Great to be here. Really excited to continue our series on communication. Tonight, we're going to be talking about what happens when leaders keep those they're trying to lead in the dark. Deacon Michael, why is this issue so important?
Well, it's important for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is it can really create a toxic culture, as you and I were discussing before we got on this live stream. You know, this so often happens in the church world. I think a lot of the times it's not intentional. It kind of goes back to our very first live stream where we talked about self-awareness. But I think it's easy to think as a leader, because you've thought it or because you've been working on it for a while, that you must have communicated it. And then you're kind of surprised when people don't feel like they've been read in and they're not engaged. And so it's really important to communicate, to not leave people in the dark, but to give them the information that they need so they can be motivated, so they can be informed, so they can be supportive, and so that they can be fully engaged.
I love it. And as somebody who's struggled with this, I am so excited to hear your points because I've experienced it when I think a lot of things in my head and I think I've communicated them and then I haven't at all. And I didn't really mean for the outcome to go the way it did. So I'm really, really grateful. As we begin, let us encourage you to post your questions in the comment section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. Deacon Michael will be answering those questions live in the second half of our show. If you want to ask your question anonymously, you can text us at 615-721-2303. All right. So how do we know when we're not communicating enough information?
Okay. Well, I was thinking about this this afternoon, and I kind of went back after I had prepared for tonight, and I went back, what would be sort of the indicators? And I came up with three. So I've got a fancy little slide here that I'll show you. So 3 indicators that people don't have enough information. So if you can't quite read the tea leaves, or you're not quite sure, if you're given enough information or too much information, which rarely happens, but it's usually the reverse. Here are some of the signs that you may not be given enough information. First of all, there's confusion in the ranks. People just aren't clear about what you said. Some people think you said X, other people think you said Y, and that can be obviously a big problem. So another indicator would be suspicion. So you wonder why people don't trust you. That may be an indicator. There's a suspicion. Maybe people are second guessing your decisions, or there's even conflict, or maybe people are negative or cynical about your organization, about the future of your organization. And Ann, I'll tell you, cynicism is like the worst thing that can happen to any organization. It's like when your culture is so bad that it's metastasized to a level of cynicism, that's pretty serious. And that happens a lot of times simply because people don't feel like they've got adequate information. And that can lead to apathy. People just don't feel motivated to participate. Maybe they're not attending services. They're not coming to confession. They're not willing to give their time or their money to your parish or your ministry because they don't know what's really going on. They feel like they're in the dark. And that's really...
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, as I look at it, I know a bunch of wonderful younger priests who end up going in and inherit a culture with all of those 3 things. And so, none of it can be anyone's fault per se if you're coming in new as a leader in a community, and yet it's there. And so sometimes it is the leader's fault, but I think in either case, this sort of antidote you're going to offer is a huge tool in the toolbox for making a difference.
Well, good. I hope so, because I really do believe this kind of stuff can be fixed. but it takes some intention. And what I'm going to share tonight is a framework that I call cascading communication. And it's got four parts to it. And I think like most things, if you're intentional and thoughtful about it, you can fix this. Here's reality. People want to belong. They want a sense that they belong to an organization, a tribe, to use kind of the current vernacular, but a group where their contributions are valued, where they're seen, where they're heard, where they're treated as partners in the ministry and not just kind of minions. And I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are in church leadership, and I'll just go ahead and say it because probably everybody's thinking this, but that are kind of old school, and there was this sort of model that existed back when I was new to my career. There was sort of the command and control model where the information was held close to the vest. It was shared only on a need-to-know basis. People had no clue what was really going on. When I was first promoted to a major leadership position at Thomas Nelson Publishers, I was given responsibility for one of Thomas Nelson's 14 book publishing divisions. And up until that point, I didn't know anything. I didn't know we were a publicly traded company, so I could certainly read the press releases that we did once a quarter on our performance, but that information was never given to us by management. And I didn't know even how the division I'd been working in for 3 years was doing until I became the leader of it and found out that we were performing terribly. We were basically on the cusp of being, completely, let go and the division being dissolved because our financial performance was dragging down the performance of the entire company. But I didn't know that. And we used to joke inside the company, if you want to know what's happening inside the company, you wait and read it in the morning paper because nobody in management is going to give you the information. And unfortunately, in that kind of situation, and you know this, we've all experienced this in leadership, is that people cannot survive in a vacuum of information because we are meaning-making creatures. We have to have meaning to make sense of our lives. And so if a meaning or a narrative is not provided, guess what happens? We create one. And usually it's wrong, right? We usually reason logically to the wrong conclusion. But in the absence of good information, we can't really be blamed. And so if you want to lead well, you've got to provide the narrative. You got to provide the reason behind decisions, why you're doing what you're doing. So you're not leaving people to guess and come to the wrong conclusion, because that's absolutely not productive. That's what gives birth to gossip and conflict and, a lot of bad stuff in the culture. And it can be easily remedied. And that's what I hope we're going to do this evening.
Awesome. Okay. How?
Okay. So 4 steps. Okay. So let's just imagine for a moment that you're a senior pastor. You're just the priest of your parish. Maybe you're senior by virtue of the fact that there's nobody else there with you on your, no other clergy there. Or maybe you're executive director like UN, or maybe you're the CEO of an institution like, St. Vladimir's or Holy Cross or something else. But just imagine a situation where you want something to change. I'm going to give you a good example. So in my organization, I run a for-profit business, Michael Hyatt and Company. We have about 70 employees. And we recently came to the conclusion as management that we needed to change our PTO policy. So I'm going to be really transparent here. So we had this really cool policy where we basically gave people unlimited PTO, paid time off. Okay, so all they had to do is they had to get it approved by their supervisor. But we really wanted to put them in the driver's seat because we want people to think like owners. So we have to treat them like owners, right? And so owners typically have a lot of discretion over their time. So we had unlimited PTO. That worked great right up until it didn't. And it didn't because with 70 people that are employed by us, it just got really unwieldy. So it was really hard to manage as an organization. So we decided we're going to change the policy, and we still wanted to have a generous paid time off policy, but we just needed to put a little structure around it because what had worked back when we were, the wild, wild west wasn't scaling so well at our size. So my daughter, Megan, who's the CEO of our company, she began to talk to the executive team about this. And so they talked about the problem. They really dug into it. They asked some people about it. They had an outside consultant. They got to where they thought it was great. And so what they decided to do next was, once the executive team was in alignment, then they decided to bring in what we call in our organization a leadership team, which is just sort of the next level down of management. And so they brought them in, and there was big pushback. So a lot of them asked some questions that nobody on the executive team thought to ask, and had some objections that we hadn't considered. And that was great. This is how cascading communication is supposed to work. Because imagine if Megan had just called an all-team meeting with 70 employees, announced the new PTO policy, and then had, mutiny on the bounty. That would not have been a good thing, or wouldn't have gone down well. Or there's at the very least, there would have been grumbling. People would have bought in. There'd be complaining. It would have been a toxic environment. But she got that input from the leadership team. They went back to the drawing board. They took into consideration what they shared. They came back with a revised policy. The leadership team bought into it. Then they shared it with the entire company. No problem. Everybody loved it. So that's the way that it can work. And I would just say that in whatever role of leadership you're in, whenever you have bad news to communicate, like maybe it's a budget deficit, maybe it's there's going to have to be some layoffs, or maybe in this COVID world, you're going to have to go back to remote, or you're going to have to shut the church down, or you're going to have to enforce masks again, or whatever it is. Anytime there's any change, what we're going to share tonight will help you do it. It won't be perfect, but it will make sure there's the greatest amount of buy-in and the least amount of blowback. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'll say that as I listened to you, the key moment there was your response, that the leadership team pushed back, and your response was, and that was great. And so it was that moment of welcoming feedback, even though it was going to cause you a ton more work.
Yes.
Having everybody go back to the drawing board, everything like that. And being willing to do that and being receptive to that feedback, trusting that you could redesign a system that would work better for everybody.
Well, that's it. And, I've said on this show before that it's important to create a culture where it's safe for dissent, because you can't eliminate dissent. You can only channel it. So if you don't create an environment that is safe for dissent, where people really can give you honest feedback or disagree with you as a leader, if you don't tolerate it, you don't make it go away. You just drive it underground. And then it blooms in very unhealthy ways. And so you've got to create a conduit for that. You've got to create a channel for that if you're going to deal with it in a healthy way. And the truth is, if you really value the people that are on your team and you value their perspective, they're going to see things you're going to miss. And that's why I said that was great, because they kept us. I'd rather stumble my toe in front of a few people than step onto stage and make a fool of myself in front of a whole bunch of people. And that's the value of a team. And that's the value of this kind of cascading communication we're going to unpack. Should we get to it?
Awesome. Let's do it.
Okay. So the first one, and some of these are going to seem fairly obvious, but, sometimes it's the basic things that we miss. So here's the first one. Let me see if I can grab the right slide here. Okay. Decide what to communicate. Decide what to communicate. Don't just stand up in front of a group of people and think to yourself, I'll just wing it. Not in a high stakes situation. If you want to change where it's going to really require people to buy into it, where you're going to need their cooperation, where you're going to need their support, where you're trying to forge alignment, then you've got to decide what to communicate. And what I would say is you've got to default to transparency. Default to transparency. Now, I don't mean you have to air all your dirty laundry to everybody, but I'm saying when in doubt, default to transparency. More information is better. Treat people like adults. They can handle it. And for many people, this is kind of a self-awareness challenge, right? So maybe they tend to value privacy, or maybe they're suspicious of how other people may use the information. And my experience has been if you trust people, they will more often than not prove themselves trustworthy. But if we treat people with suspicion, people tend to fulfill our expectations. So transparency is one of those things where it builds trust. When people feel like you've shared information with them that you didn't have to, but you regarded them as an important part of the team, and you're giving them this information and treating them like adults, people respect that, even with hard things, whether it's layoffs or financial deficits or whatever it is. As long as people are considered, then my experience has been that they respond well. Now, just this is not theory for me. So one of the things that happened to me when I was at Thomas Nelson is I led the company through the Great Recession. We had to go through 2 rounds of layoffs. We had about 750 employees, and we had to lay off about 75 in round 1 and another 75 in round 2. These were people that we had worked side by side with, people who through no fault of their own were getting let go. It was brutal. So the question was, how can we honor the people that we're letting go, treat them with dignity and respect and grace, but at the same time, lead the company through this so that we don't, do this poorly, but we do this in the best way we can so that the organization, because really the people inside the organization, I wanted them to see this and think, wow, that was a hard situation, but I'm proud of the way that we handled it. And that's the kind of thing you're after. So I think you got to decide what the message is got to be. So ask yourself, what do people need to know to be supportive, to be motivated, to be engaged, and then provide that. And I never go into that situation without talking points, but I'll talk more about that here in a minute. But, some examples like you're going to hire a new assistant pastor. My church, is considering that possibility right now. Building a new temple. That may be something where you need this kind of cascading communication and you need people to just buy in. Firing or laying off staff members. Experiencing a budget shortfall or a deficit. And this is going to be an example, and you know this, but for the sake of those that are watching that don't know this, I'm the executive chair of St. Vladimir's Seminary in Yonkers, New York, and we've announced to the world that we're relocating the seminary. We don't know where yet. We've got a relocation committee that's studying that, but we've decided we're going to relocate the seminary. Well, that's a major change. That campus has been there since I think the late 30s, or at least in the New York area since the late 30s. And so this is a major shift. There's a lot of emotional connection to the location, a lot of memories. I mean, you're a graduate of St. Vlad's, and I'm sure it's just hard for you to think about that. A different campus, what? It's kind of part of, the whole ethos and the whole experience. So that's where, it requires cascading communication. And so we decided as we went through this process, we've been into it for about 2 years now, that we had to decide that we were going to communicate that, because inevitably when you're making a big change like that, there's going to be leakage. People are going to get wind of it no matter how much you try to batten down the hatches and keep things under wraps. And, people are just going to let it slip and it's going to get out there. So we felt like we had to communicate, and we wanted to communicate with as much transparency as we could of exactly where we were in the process, and the fact that we had come to the conclusion, we'd voted, we come to the conclusion that we're going to relocate the seminary. That requires cascading communication, and I'll use that as an example as we go through here. Any comments you have on that first point?
Well, no, I mean, it's just great. There's nothing like feeling like you're out of the loop to make you cranky about something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I loved the opposite was just, you want people to be supportive, motivated, engaged.
That's it.
And so thinking about that.
And I think a lot of times, as leaders, we get frustrated with people because we think, why aren't they more motivated? Why aren't they more engaged? Why aren't they giving to this? Look, one of the questions I like to ask myself, and I've asked it of myself, even this last week in another situation, what was it about my leadership that led to this? Because blaming, frankly, not that helpful.
Yeah.
But as the leader, if the buck truly stops with you, and if you're really leading, and if you could ask yourself, okay, what was it about my leadership that created this situation? Why aren't people more engaged? Why aren't they more motivated? Why aren't they bought in? Maybe it's the way that I'm leading. The good news about that is I can fix that. I can change my leadership. A lot easier to fix me than fix everybody else.
That's great. Okay, so step 1 is to decide what to communicate. What is step 2?
Step 2 is to get the message right. So once you've determined what to communicate, you got to craft the message. And this is especially true when cascading communication involves a significant announcement or a significant change. There's some things you've got to do to encourage clarity, because you don't want to make it worse, or you don't want to leave people confused or leave them scratching their heads wondering, what did they just say? And we've all got those long emails or read those press releases where we go, I'm not sure exactly what they're doing because this just isn't clear. So one of the things I would encourage you to do, those of you watching, if you're in a position of leadership, is write it down, because writing clarifies thinking. Sometimes it's you think you know what you want to say, but until you actually write it down, you're not clear yourself. So I would write it out literally as a press release or as a series of talking points. So like, for example, in the situation I gave about our company changing its PTO policy, no need for a press release because the public doesn't need to know, public doesn't care. That was totally an internal thing. But we needed talking points. And we needed to make sure that not only did the CEO have the talking points for the all company meeting, but then all the leaders had the talking points too, so that they could reinforce it in alignment with the CEO. So that's exactly what we did. So a press release or talking points. In the case of St. Vlad's, we wrote the press release, and we did it in as much detail. And that really helped clarify. And it also helped ensure alignment, because once you get it committed to paper, then you have people saying, oh, I thought we said this, not that. But when it's in writing, all of a sudden it's clear, it's in black and white, it's easier to evaluate. I would also say get straight to the point. Get straight to the point. Don't, in the newspaper business, they call it burying the lead. Don't bury the lead. What's the main point you're trying to make? Put that in the headline. And I've learned from all my years as a copywriter of a very important point, and that is that 80% of the people don't read past the headline. They don't read past the headline. So, for example, in the case of the seminary, this is literally the headline. I'm reading from the press release. Board votes to relocate St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. Location to be determined. Location to be determined. So, we didn't want to bury the lead. We wanted it right up there, right at the very top. Always include your rationale. If people understand the why, it makes the medicine go down. And I think there were probably a lot of people, maybe even you, Ann, as a graduate of St. Vlad's, when you hear the news, you've got a lot of nostalgia about the current location. And you're like, what? How can we move somewhere else? We've got all this heritage, all these amazing luminaries that have taught there and been the deans and all this stuff. And how could we do that? But then you read the rationale, and we literally provided the rationale as a series of bullet points. Here's exactly why not only are we choosing to, but we must move the seminary. Here's another thing I've found that's really helpful. We didn't do it in that particular press release, but we always do this in an internal announcement. Some people like change better than others. Some people love change. I love it. Some people hate it. Scares them, makes them nervous. They go to the worst case scenario, they catastrophize, whatever. So it's important to be explicit about what's not going to change. And in fact, I like to start there. So, for example, a few years ago, I said, look, in a couple of years, Megan, my daughter, is going to become the CEO of this company. So we are entering into a period of intentional succession. Let me tell you, before I get into the details of that, because we have a whole plan mapped out, I want to tell you what's not going to change. And I said, what's not going to change is our mission. We're still committed to the same mission that we've been committed to. What's also not going to change is our core values. What's also not going to change is our vision for the future. So I went through a sort of a laundry list of things that were not going to change so that people could stand on that steady platform and absorb the change that we were about to announce. And it went great. We didn't have any problems as a result of that. And I would say too that in some situations, particularly high stakes situations like at the archdiocese or some big institution, if you need to bring in a professional, a copywriter or communications expert to help you craft that, do it. There are people that are really, really good at this. A lot of boards will have a lot of talent on the board that can help with that.
Yeah, that's great. I think having people alongside you to help shape what getting the message right looks like, and if you're at a parish, who are the people who are communicators? And you're not a communicator, and you pull in the communicators who can sit with you and help strategize what that looks like. If you're an organization, board members, who are the board members who just think about that and know how to craft messages in really energizing ways.
Yes.
If that's the forte.
Yep. In the case of the seminary, we have somebody on the staff who's in charge of communication and who is an excellent writer. And I mean, he had a press release ready to go almost instantly after we made the decision, when we finished the board meeting. And so we all reviewed it, and there were some things we had to tweak and, a little bit of a disagreement about what we had decided. We had to kind of go back and clean that up, but it's all great. That's just part of the process. Expect that. And that's where I think that's where you have to really welcome and embrace the people that dissent or that may object, because the tendency is just like to kind of stiff arm and like, I don't want to hear from that person because I know that they're going to object to this. Well, actually, you want to hear from them, because if you can't come up with a way to counter their objection or to help them understand, and I get that sometimes people are just disagreeable and, maybe they need to find another church or need to find another assignment or whatever. And I'm not trying to be flip about that, but, you can't be all things to all people all the time. But to the extent that you can, to try to fold them in, it makes the decision better.
It's great. Okay, so step one is to decide what to communicate. Step two is to get the message right. Tell us step three.
Step three is determine who needs to know and in what order. Determine who needs to know this information and in what order you want to present it. Now, this is critical because it can fall apart if you don't get it right. And I've seen this happen over and over again, where a CEO or a pastor has a big announcement, doesn't run it by anybody, maybe not even the parish council, makes the announcement to the congregation and gets enormous blowback. And it could have been so much easier if they'd had a process, cascading communication, and if they'd worked through it top to bottom in order. So you need to think about beginning at the top and moving down to include everyone who needs to know in the right order. And by top, I don't necessarily mean the bishop or the pastor or the executive director. I mean the people who should be informed first. Who are the people that you want to secure their alignment with first before you open it up to a broader audience? And generally, information will cascade through various levels of leadership, but there are exceptions. So I've got actually a little chart here that I want to show in. So I'm going to use the example of St. Vladimir Seminary, and this is cascading communication. So the way that this worked was that the CEO, who's on the ground, Father Chad, working every day, is seeing the challenges of that existing location. And one of the challenges is that it's in New York State. Very, very expensive real estate, very high cost of living, which was making it increasingly difficult to recruit students who couldn't afford to live there or faculty who couldn't afford to live there. So that was a major issue. So he said, we've been talking about this for years. We proposed it, but it's time to get serious. So it started with him. Then it goes to the board. But even there's an order to it. So the first thing he did was he talked to me as the board chair, executive chair. And I said, I think you're exactly right. He gave me his rationale. I said, this makes total sense. I know it's going to be difficult. This is going to be an enormous project, But yeah. So then what's the next step? Well, then again, still within the board, then we brought it to the executive committee, which is a subgroup of the board that meets in between board meetings. And you kind of want to get alignment there first, because if the executive committee comes to the full board with a recommendation, it's easier for them to buy into it as well. And then we went to the full board. So once the board made the decision, then we went to the faculty and the staff. And we said, look, these are the people that are going to be impacted by this. They have the right to know, and they need to understand the rationale for this. Now, if this was just sprung on them without the rationale, the whole thing could go sideways. But Father Chad, before a press release was let out, before we went public with this, he met with the faculty and the staff and he explained the rationale. Then the students need to know. And we don't want them reading it, in some church newspaper somewhere or online somewhere or getting the worst spin. We wanted them to hear it straight from Father Chad. Then it went from there to external constituents. There were people, that we were in partnership with, whether it was, theological associations or, different groups that needed to know. We went to them. And then public. So that's how it went with the seminary. So it was cascading, almost like a waterfall where the information is going down. And at each stage, you're taking into consideration any objections, any concerns people have. And there are naturally concerns. And sometimes you're going to want to have to come back and retool or polish or fine tune a little bit. But the more that it moves down, the more it gets set in concrete, right? So that if it's been through this process, it's going to be a high quality, sound decision. But it's got to start. If you're going to create alignment as opposed to disalignment, if you want to create motivation and engagement where people are on board and ready to move with you in this change, there's got to be a process.
You mean you don't just think who's going to get mad at you and go with them first?
Well, a lot of times, sadly, a lot of people go with that. Who's going to get mad at me? I'm going to go to them last. Or they get informed by somebody that doesn't have the full thing. Somebody comes into their office with their hair on fire and they didn't hear it from you as the leader. They heard it from somebody who has only heard a rumor, who has part of the facts and gets them all worked up. And you could have diffused that if you had communicated as part of a deliberate, systematic, orderly process.
Yeah.
Can I give you another example?
Oh, yeah, I'd love it.
Actually, you probably have an example here, but what would it look like in a parish? Because I know a lot of times on these live streams, we have people that are in a parish. So in this situation, let's say that you're the senior pastor. Now, I'm envisioning a situation here where you might have more than one staff person or maybe more than one clergyman inside the organization. So if you don't have that kind of organization, you're going to be able to skip some of these steps. But it starts with the senior pastor. Let's say he has an idea that he wants to present. Maybe it's an annual fundraising campaign, wants to build a new temple, whatever it is. He may need to get the bishop involved. Again, you don't want the bishop hearing after this is out in the wild. Maybe the bishop doesn't need to be notified and he doesn't, it's one of those things that doesn't really require or demand his input. But you got to ask yourself the question, if the bishop hears this from somebody else other than me, is he going to be okay with that? So I would rather default to transparency, even with the bishop, and make sure that he's aligned with it. Then from there, other parish clergy, if you have them, so they're not surprised when you take it further. That's the key thing you're trying to avoid, is surprise here. Then the parish council, make sure they're on board. They've got a chance to give input, provide feedback, all the rest. If you have any lay leaders, depending on the structure of your church, maybe there's some key positions that need to be involved. And then finally, the faithful, everybody else.
That's awesome.
So I think if we follow that simple process, we can avoid so many problems in the church.
That's awesome. So helpful, Deacon Michael. Thank you. So far, you've covered 3 steps: decide what to communicate, get the message right, and determine who needs to know. and in what order. So what's the final step?
Okay, the final step, let me scroll up to this one here. Pretty simple. Clarify as needed. Now, this is a step that's often missed, but can be so helpful. But here's what it is. Expect that your communication is going to raise questions. That's normal. So the best thing you can do, particularly on these really big consequential decisions, is anticipate the questions in advance. Prepare a list of every possible objection you can think of. What are people going to say when they hear this for the first time? And by the way, people typically think, what's this going to mean for me? That's how most of us think. What's this going to mean for me? So if that's the case, then go ahead and write down that question, that objection, and then prepare simple talking points for each one of these. Now, the way I learned this was back when I was running Thomas Nelson's, a publicly held company. Once a quarter, we had a big meeting with the financial analysts on Wall Street to report on our operating results. And as the CEO, I had to give a report on, here's what we did the last quarter. Here's kind of what we see going forward and all that. And we gave them a chance to ask questions. Well, man, the stakes were so high because if I gave the wrong answer or if I just, shot from the hip and gave an answer that wasn't accurate or was misleading or was just a gaffe, it could impact our stock price. And I would have investors really angry with me. So what we always did is I got together and with my team, and we constructed the press release first, and then the talking points that we wanted to cover in the call with the analysts. And then we came up with every possible objection and we put those together in a briefing book. This is overkill for mostly what we're going to be doing in the church, but for some projects, maybe not. But in that briefing book, we put on a separate page the question and then a few talking points. Now, this was in the days before Zoom. So we were sitting around a conference table in a legit conference call. But when an analyst asked a question, we had an index. We would just flip to that. And it's very rare that we got to ask a question we hadn't thought of beforehand. But we would turn to that page and we'd walk through the talking points. That allowed us to be concise, succinct, and to look like we'd thought through it and had a good response. Sometimes they'd ask questions that made us go back to the drawing board. But we wanted to anticipate what the questions are. And here's the key thing. You can't afford as a leader to be defensive. If you find yourself in a position where you're being defensive, you really haven't done the job. You haven't been clear, or you haven't provided enough rationale for people to buy into it. But it doesn't hurt. And I've done this several times where we just did a certification for one of our products where we certified people to use it and to teach it. And I got asked several questions, first time we'd ever done this. And I got asked by the people that were going through the program certain questions I couldn't answer. And I just said, you know what? I don't know. This is the first time we've done it. And we didn't consider that question. People appreciated the honesty. And I said, look, that's a great question. We didn't consider it. We'll get back to you with an answer. And I had somebody keep a track of those questions, and we did get back with an answer to all those people. So there's nothing wrong with saying you don't know. You're human, and it makes you look human.
I don't know. I didn't consider it, and I'll get back to you with a question. Those are 3 golden sentences.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think it'd be so hard to do it. And I think that's where, as leaders, particularly in a Christian context, we really have to be humble, and we have to model that.
Yeah.
We don't have to have all the answers, but we have to be humble, and we have to, acknowledge that we don't have the answers and just get back to people, and that's okay.
I love it. So good. All right. So we want to get to our listeners' questions, but first let's summarize what you said, Deacon Michael. So there are 3 indicators that you're not communicating enough information: confusion, suspicion, and apathy. If you find yourself in this situation, you need to use a technique called cascading communication. You then provided a 4-step framework. Step 1, decide what to communicate. Step 2, get the message right. Step 3, determine who needs to know and in what order. And step 4, clarify as needed. Okay, with that, let's take some questions. Again, if you have a question or even a comment, just post it in the comment section below.
I do want to respond to, I think by virtue of his profile picture, I think he's a priest. He's got an Emperor Trickelion on. Father Peter Cox. He says, I'm looking forward to St. Vladimir's relocating to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I know that rumor's out there. There has been no commitment made. The relocation committee is doing its work. It's considering about 10 different cities. DFW is one of them, for sure. But it's not the only one, and that decision has not been made. So whoever you heard that from, it's not accurate. Just felt like I needed to clear that up.
That's good.
He did have this question, and I think this is this point, which I think is really valid. In a parish, leaders don't always have titles. It's important to know who they are and include them in the process. Amen to that.
That was so helpful.
There's sort of, in any organization, there's the, what sometimes people call the de jure leadership, the legal authorized people that have the titles. And then there's the de facto leadership, the people that are actually leading. These people may not be part of the parish council, but they've got a lot of influence, and maybe they're big donors, but you got to bring them in. You got to consider them, from the get-go. You got to figure out when you're going to communicate and how you're going to communicate to them.
I love it. We had somebody else just say, prepare a FAQ sheet.
Yes.
Which I loved.
I like what Father Peter just said. You'll love this. He said, I hadn't heard that. I'm just pushing it. Yeah, good for you. We've got a lot of people who I think are working part-time for the Chamber of Commerce wherever they live, because we've gotten long letters advocating. And it's nice to be loved, and it's nice to be wanted. And so we thank you for that.
That's awesome.
Did you have a question also that you said was emailed to us? That actually didn't have anything
to
do with this, but yeah.
Yeah, no, not directly, but I think so much right now, certainly everything up in this area is now online. So I guess the question is, do you have tips for, this is a broad question, but tips for organizations, companies, parishes right now that the communication all has to be electronic, over Zoom, over email, by phone. And again, is there any difference? So that's a two-part question. So, how does communication differ when you can't meet in person?
Yeah.
And then the second would be, and your St. Vladimir's examples are ones with volunteer boards, but what about, so I guess more on when you're talking about what are the dynamics of working with volunteer leaders that might be different from working with a company again?
Those are two good questions. Let me take the volunteer one first. I basically consider everybody a volunteer, even the people I pay. And in this job market, they kind of are. And even if they don't have a choice financially, they have to be working, and they have to work for you. Maybe they don't want to go back into the job market or whatever. Here's what is voluntary: their engagement. Whether they're phoning it in, so to speak, or they're all in and really engaged. So I treat them the same exact way. Okay,
I'm going to push you here, though, a little bit. The difference is, if they don't engage, you get to not work with them and not deal with them.
That is,
and not worry about the repercussion.
That's where I would do my very best to enroll them, make them feel like they're partners in the ministry, that they've got a voice into it. And in my experience, Ann, and again, you've got way more experience in church leadership than I do, but in my experience, when people feel like they've got a voice into the process and they know that they've been considered and seen, then even if the decision doesn't go their direction, they're usually able to align. If they don't, they probably go somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing. One of the things you and I have talked about a lot is the fact that we're stewards. And I take my stewardship very seriously. And the people that God gives us to work with, we're stewards of those relationships. And the one thing about stewardship is nothing is forever. The money that I have, I'm a steward of it. Eventually, all goes back to God. It's on loan to me from him to use for his glory and the furtherance of his kingdom. Same thing with people.
Mm.
Everybody that I've been given has been given to me on loan, and there's going to come a time, they're here for a season. There's going to come a time when they go somewhere else. And so I don't mind some of that churn. I just don't want it to be because the culture was toxic or I was a bad leader or something like that.
Yeah, that's good.
Should I get to the other question?
Yeah, that would be great.
The
Online.
the
Yeah,
remote
that's
thing.
sort of electronic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's amazing where the technology has come from or where it's come in the last 2 years plus during this pandemic, where all of us are doing lots of Zoom calls and all that. I think one of the things we can't lose as Orthodox Christians is kind of the principle of incarnational communication. And by that, I mean, I suppose Jesus could have waited and had a Zoom call with us when that technology was available, but he came in the flesh and he was with his disciples in person. This is why I believe so strongly in the necessity of residential seminary work. I think it's best if students can be on campus and participate in the liturgical life of the church and participate in spiritual development in community. And I think all that, you do the best you can. And sometimes you don't have a choice, like in the pandemic. But I think that face-to-face is something that we just can't capitulate and say, that's not really important. Maybe we could just do church, online, and that suffices. Thankfully, we're sacramental and Eucharistic in our viewpoint. We know that's not possible. We need to get together, face-to-face to celebrate the Eucharist. But there's a lot of churches that have given up on that. They are going to be, from now going forward, online. So I think we got to do as much as we can, the best we can with the technology that we have. And that's why I believe in Zoom over phone calls or any kind of video technology, Microsoft Teams, whatever you use. And I insist that people leave their cameras on, because I think that it gives us the parts of communication that are nonverbal, which, by the way, are the majority. And all of us have had the experience. I was on vacation last week and, trying to understand restaurant workers or flight attendants when they have a mask on. And you realize it's not that I'm hard of hearing. My hearing's fine. But it's hard to understand people when you can't see their lips moving, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that to the extent the situation will permit it, even if you're remote working, get together. Even if you get together on Zoom for non-work related things to have fun. There's a website that we just discovered a couple of weeks ago that we're using now called With Confetti, withconfetti.com. And when you go to this website, it says unforgettable team building experiences. And it's kind of designed for, remote teams. But I think you've got to build in the fun. You've got to build in connection. When you have connection, you have trust. When you have trust, everything in an organization works better. So that small chit chat in meetings that you have at the beginning of a meeting, don't let it get it out of control, but it's important, because it creates a connection. People want to know that you care, beyond, just the amount of productivity that they get done.
Yeah, the one thing I was thinking about, just out of my experience the last couple of weeks, is you do have to work harder when you're not in person to make sure people have access to you when they need to if something comes up. So I actually had a decision roll out. It had missed one spot, and one of my team members realized it and was able to, and God bless her, was able to shoot me a thing and said, I do need to talk today to let you know. And I was able to then follow up on what she perceived, which I'd missed.
Great.
Yeah, great. But it did mean, it was a meeting full of a morning full of meetings before I could get to it. Whereas I think probably if we'd been in the office together, it would have been a 30-second moment that would have taken 3 minutes to be, to fix, as opposed to several more calls that took longer.
Yes. Yeah, it takes more intention. It's more work. And I think, I can't wait till we can get back to something closer to normal, although there are so many companies now. And I'm sure this is going to be true for ministries too, not church, but for ministries, where they're just going to say, hey, you know what? This remote thing's pretty great. Don't have the commute, all that stuff. We have, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, where there's a huge Southern Baptist presence here. The Southern Baptist Sunday School Board is here, which is their largest organization in their denomination. They sold their big building downtown, and they bought a smaller building downtown a couple of years ago before the pandemic. They just sold that. They're buying a very small building out here in the suburbs. And because their people don't want to come in. And so all that's changed. And so I think that's where we got to get creative and decide how can we be intentional about community and not have these communication misses and all the rest. It's a new way of working.
It's so interesting because I think in general, it's probably going to be ideally better for families, and yet, but then not great for potentially harder on work culture.
What we're going to, and what we were doing before the pandemic, is we referred to it as a hybrid model. So we had a co-working space. So we said, look, there's sometimes we just need to get together face to face. And there are going to be some days of the week that we're going to require people to be in the office. And before the pandemic, it was like, I think we had 2 days a week. You had to be in the office on these 2 days. The other days you could work from anywhere. So I see Father Peter has another good comment.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the end here, I know. He said, any tips on how to overcome emotional objections to objective conclusions? For example, unfounded optimism based on nostalgia, leading to people ignoring the financial numbers and trends. You know, one of the things, this is so good, Father Peter, such a great comment. And all of us have experienced this. And I think that one of the best ways to handle this is to go ahead and give voice to it. So in other words, if you can say before they have to say it, you know, some of you may be thinking that, you know, God's just going to provide. And certainly I've thought that in the past, but what we don't want to do, we certainly want to be hopeful and we want to have faith, but we also have to be honest and recognize our current reality. And so I think you can take the objection. So what did somebody call this one time? There's a martial art where you use your opponent's body weight against them. But in this case, you take the objection and you pivot and you use it to kind of make your point. So let people go ahead and make the objection, you know, to whatever it is. Or it could be a negative objection. You know, somebody may say, you know, and I've had this at the seminary and elsewhere where people say, you know, we've tried a capital campaign before and it just never works. So instead of letting somebody voice that, if I, as the leader, start with saying, look, maybe you're thinking we've had capital campaigns before and they've just never worked. And I've been here with you when they haven't worked. And I know the disappointment that creates and even the cynicism about it. But I want to share with you why this is going to be different this time. So you acknowledge it, you address it, you especially acknowledge the emotion of it. But then go ahead and give yourself an opportunity to present why it's going to be different this time or why it needs to be different this time.
That's great. One more comment from Randa Anderson. Thank you, Randa. Many church ministries will always and forever have meetings online because board members live across the country and there aren't many chances to gather in person.
And that's okay.
And just to drill down on your potential website with confetti.com and other things, you know, we just had we had a think tank and spent a good 45 minutes to an hour of 2 half days and a full day at the beginning, just doing something silly and fun and, you know, getting ourselves to remember the quirks of everybody else and how funny and appreciate people for who they are. And of course, I had somebody else run it because I want to be productive. And I knew that, you know, I knew that about myself, that I needed to have one of my fabulous teammates figure out what was going to be good for that, because otherwise I would have edged it out.
That's good. Yeah. Well, you know, we just have to do the best we can in these situations. And sometimes, you know, we need to be creative. Like I'm trying to think, I was speaking at a conference, and after the conference, they wanted to have a virtual cocktail hour with all the speakers. And they sent us in the mail a bottle of wine all the speakers. And so we all opened it together. They said, now don't open this until we tell you. So we had this box that we suspected was wine, but it wasn't opened. And then we opened it together. And then we had a glass of wine. And we did this online. Was it as
That's
good
a
as being in
great
person?
idea.
No, but it was pretty creative. Wasn't bad.
I love that. That's awesome. Awesome, awesome.
All
All
right.
right. Well, I think we're nearing our time for tonight, but we so appreciate everyone joining us. We'll
Yes.
be back here again, God willing, next week at the same time. We plan to discuss how to motivate those you're trying to lead. In other words, how do you persuade them to fully engage and do what they need to do? I have a feeling a lot of our listeners, and I myself, are going to be very eager for this next one. Deacon Michael, as we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on this topic of cascading communication?
Yeah, I've been doing this now for about 20 years, this process of cascading communication. I've made my fair share of mistakes, but it goes amazingly well now. And almost every time we have a major thing that we've got to announce, we just default to it. And you get better at it. But here's the key thing that I want you to take away from this, is that this is one of the best culture building tools you can ever employ. Because when people feel like they're being considered, when there's a deliberate process, when the communication's clear and they have an opportunity to understand the rationale behind it, it changes the culture. People feel like, hey, I belong here. These are my people. This is my mission, my core values, my vision, and they buy into it. And that's priceless.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deacon Michael.
Thank you, Ann. Appreciate you leading us through it. And thank you guys for watching. See you next week, God willing.